Okay, Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Keith. Delighted to see so many people from overseas in the UK on the call. I'm delighted to welcome Nick Birns, who I think will be well known to many of you. Nick was a founding member of the Society and has really contributed to the Society over the last few years. His book, Understanding Anthony Powell, is a plug for you, Nick. Here it is, almost the definitive guide for those of us who want to get deeper into what Anthony Powell has done through his works. I can heartily recommend. Nick has agreed to talk to us on Anthony Powell's fourth novel, Agents and Patients. So I'll hand you over to Nick. Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Keith, for all that you do, and thanks all of you for showing up on a Saturday afternoon. I am going to share my screen, and then I'm going to play from start. Okay, you should all be seeing that. And Extraneous Things, Anthony Powell's Agents and Patients. People who have unsorted love affairs have extraneous things to fall back on. Sorted love affairs have to be their own reward. Maltravers and Agents and Patients. Oh, now I have to flip through all of this again. How boring. Maltravers and Agents and Patients says that when talking about sorted love affairs and unsorted love affairs. And I think it's interesting that sets up my dynamic between what I would call the hard and the soft in the novel. And the hard is kind of what actually is, and the soft is that which has some elasticity or some give. And what I mean by that will become clear as we go on. Agents and Patients, as Paul has said, is his fourth novel. It's his last one before, and this is, you know, it's usually said, what's become of wearing prefigures dance to the music of time in being a first-person point of view. Another way to say it is, Agents and Patients is the last one before Oh, How the Wheel Becomes a distance of 45 years, not to have a first-person narrator. And it thus can be seen, if you see what's become of wearing as prefiguring dance, it can be seen as the final point in the evolution of the mode Powell had been working on throughout the 1930s. And as I'm going to talk about, some people like the pre-war novels better. Sir Frank Kermode certainly was one of them. And they are a distinct mode, and we will talk about what that mode was in the course of the talk. Jeffrey Uther Ellis, G.U. Ellis, the first critic to fully appreciate Powell's talent, and the only literary critic, as far as I know, to be named after Uther Pendragon, remarked on the way the early fiction attempted successfully to eliminate the intrusion of circumstances and to present a world more like our own experience with no pattern, no sequence, no denouement. If you are interested in Twilight and Parnassus, you can get a copy of it on the secondary market for maybe about 40, 50 pounds. It's a bit hefty, but it's worth it because it's a large book. There's a lot of stuff about British literature from Edwardian times onward, and it gives AP a very large place. And it gives AP, in a way, the place that he deserves and that we think he deserves, but that not a lot of people, certainly in the 1930s, and a lot of surveys, even in the 1950s and 1960s, didn't do. And I think Ellis has a great deal of insight into the absence of the extraneous in the book, the way there isn't much beyond the bare minimum in the early fiction. Like Sorted Love Affairs, the events of Powell's early fiction have to be their own reward. And there's a title page of Twilight on Parnassus. Joe Tren, our bookseller member, made sure I got a copy of this many years ago, and I'm very grateful for that. It's a book that I have used many times. Ellis, though, and the one, I'm not faulting Ellis, but I think a limitation on Ellis, he does tend to see Afternoon Man as the paradigm of Powell's early fiction. And as Jeff Manley pointed out in his fine talk he gave to us in April, Afternoon Men is its own thing. It has that palindromic structure. It's a very unique structure, and it's not necessarily carrying the subsequent three novels, certainly not Venusberg, which because of its setting and jaunty humor is its own thing. From a View to a Death is not like Afternoon Men. There's a sense of futility, there's a sense of inconclusiveness, but it is not as static. And Ellis generally tends to enroll AP in Wyndham Lewis's anti-time crusade. And Wyndham Lewis hated time. He spoke of the time disease. And to Percy Wyndham Lewis, time was synonymous with liberalism and progress and all those things he hated, following T.E. Hume in that respect. And a lot of people likened AP to Wyndham Lewis, and I understand why. They were both satiric, they were both kind of sending up trendy posturings of modernity, but Anthony Powell goes on to write Dance to the Music of Time and goes on to emulate Proust. And that is going a different path than Wyndham Lewis. And that makes a lot of what Ellis says sound odd. And you could use, when you talk about what Ellis is saying, you can talk about alienation, dislocation, deracination, rather than just annulling time per se, which again, a Dance to the Music of Time is not going to want to do. Yeah, I agree with Ellis that Agents and Patience is very much characterized by what Ellis describes as a sense of irony as one of the incongruities. And I've been teaching a lot of World War I fiction, and I have been working with AP's friend and Kingsley Amos's friend, Paul Fussell, author of The Great War in Modern Memory, and what the finest book about World War I literature, and what he says about irony there, and the incongruity of irony. And that's very similar to what Ellis is saying with Pohl. Pohl, as Ellis says, uses irony to simply point out the quirkiness of life that is already there. These are the dramatis personae of the book, and this is taken from Pohl's journals, the nice entry on July 8th, 1988, the second volume of the journals. And these are the relations of the people in the novel to real people. Peter Maltravers, based on, I always pronounced it Haygate, but I saw an interview with AP where he pronounced it something like Hooget. I'm not going to carry off Hooget. So I'm just going to say Haygate. That reminds me of my first visit to the Chantry, when I thought you were to call it the Chantry, or then I went to the taxi driver and said, "Take me to the Chantry," and he said, "Oh, do you mean the Chantry?" Pronouncing it just like I, with my broad Northeastern American accent, would say it. So I'm just going to say Haygate. And John Haygate's affair with Evelyn Gardner, later Nightingale, caused the divorce between she, Evelyn, and he, Evelyn. Haygate was also portrayed in Romans à Clef by Waugh and by Henry Williamson. Henry Williamson was the guy Haygate attended Hitler's Nuremberg rally with. I guess if you want to attend the Nuremberg rally, you need a buddy. You don't want to do that on your own. In any event, that was Maltravers. And Maltravers and Chip Chase are the villains of the novel. They're the ones who delude poor Blore Smith, our protagonist. We have Oliver Chip Chase, who's curiously modeled on Pohl himself, merely as a cog in the story. And this is what Pohl says in the journals, and I would like to even ask him a bit more about that. Pohl, as others might see him, and it's so interesting because Chip Chase is neither a positively portrayed character nor a character given any kind of subjectivity. And it's a very self-effacing authorial gesture. Of course, AP is a very self-effacing author. Mrs. Mendoza, I'm gonna have to go through all this now. Mrs. Mendoza, Mendy, as she's called in the book, is modeled on obviously Mrs. Varda. And as revealed by Sperling, And even the notorious Neil Brennan thought that AP had an affair with Mrs. Varda. I don't think AP was very pleased by that, but even Neil Brennan in his Twain book said that was his opinion. And I'm going to give her her own slide, but I just wanted to establish that there. Commander Hugo Venables, and that could be Venables, I'm just pronouncing it Venables because that's the way it's natural to me to say, based on Captain Charles Edward Turle, RN, who did mine clearance in First World War, who was Basilion Tagma to Gorgoria A. In other words, he was Royal Squadron of George, commanded George II in the First World War, commanded Greek Naval Squadron in the Second, so had experience with the Greek Navy. I assume AP got that name Venables from the diary of Francis Kilvert, who, if you don't know that book, it's a diary in the early 1870s in the mid-Victorian era of a clergyman in the Welsh borders. It's for people who love nature writing and also kind of life writing. It's a very important book. It's a book AP knew well because of his Radnor sheer interests. And I suspect he was already beginning to research genealogy. I suspect he got the name Venables from Kilvert's diary. And that is the beginning, I think, how you will see AP get names that you will see in dance, names like Isbister, Lentwardine, Warminster, Token House, Wimberpool itself, which of course he got from Mrs. Hutchinson's memoirs. He got some names, I think, from Aubrey. The way he will fossick around history and geography for unusual yet plausible surnames. Funnily, in the novel, the characters always call him Commodore, even though, in fact, he has the lower rank of commander. Reggie Frott, the gallery owner, was based on Fred Mayer, whose gallery was in Cork Street. And as Sperling has revealed, he introduced Powell to Marion Coates. And Marion Coates was the big discovery of Sperling's biography, the lover who AP, in essence, jilted when he met Lady Violet. And then we have Fräulein Grunt, who's based on Thea Struve, who AP says in 1988 died in a Nazi concentration camp. But one online source says that Dorothea Struve, who was a photographer and friend of Man Ray, in fact lived until about the time AP was writing the entry. So maybe she didn't die in the concentration camp. Who knows? In any event, that's what he thought when he was writing the journal entry. And it's very interesting to think, the diarist recollecting the past and thinking, oh, she died in a concentration camp, but in fact, she might be still alive. And that in itself could be a short story if somebody wanted to write it. Okay. As I said, the third person narrator in Agents and Patients. It's interesting, though, that AP admits what he's just admitted, that he admits forthrightly this is based on real people, the way he does with dance as well. Some more character models. Roland Inglethorne is based on Donald Calthrop, actor 1888-1940. He died in Eton while filming an adaptation of Shaw's Major Barbara. Again, that's something that could be put in a novel. The Duchesse de Borodino is in fact Violette, Princesse de Eugene Murat. The Napoleonic commonality of Murat and Borodino, fairly obvious. Marquis de Tour d'Espagne, I talk about this in my book. It's a literary allusion to Gerard de Nerval through T.S. Eliot. Mao Sissi, who was a character model for this guy, I could not find any Google results on him. Perhaps AP misspelled the name. He sometimes misspelled names late in life, but I could find no information on Comte de Mao Sissi. The premise of the book is that Bloor Smith is being deluded by Chip Chase and Mal Travers under the premise of them making a film about psychoanalysis. And of course, film and psychoanalysis were two of the new things in the 21st century, of the 20th century. And the novel very much is set in the 20th century. But the way Ship Chase and Maltravers use this premise as a scam, as a con game, is a kind of critique of modernism. And this is something Wyndham Lewis would certainly do, of satirizing the way modernism, its cultural currency, was a con game. And it could be a con game. Almost anything can be a con game, and certainly anything trendy can be a con game. On the other hand, before we say, oh, AP hated modernism and was sending it up, he respected T.S. Eliot, he respected Marcel Proust, he respected, to at least a degree, James Joyce. He respected a lot of people who were modernists, and he was not nostalgic for anything before modernity. There's an entry in the journals, I forget where a magazine asks AP, what's your ideal age to live in? And he doesn't say, oh, Tudor England. He doesn't say, oh, it's in the Norman, whatever, the first years of the Norman conquest. He says, this era, for all its problems, I'd rather live in this era than anywhere else. And I think the novels bring that through, even though he is very satiric of stuff that people buy into that's trendy at the time, but that has the potential at least to be a con game. Bloor-Smith as Patients, the title of the novel is Agents and Patients. And the agents are those who exploit, the patients are those who exploited. Bloor-Smith is an ingenue, a young man waiting for the world to exploit him and lead him into labyrinths. He's very interested in women, but doesn't find it easy to relate to women. Asking Sarah Maltravers, do you want to be my mistress? Something which is not really going to get a positive response from most women. And the book's title comes from that distinction. Interestingly, he gets it from John Wesley, from the Methodist divine. It would be very interesting to know how he came by that quote. We know AP's mother, that Maud Wells Dimmock Powell, had some interest in kind of the lowish band of Protestantism, and maybe she read Wesley. It'd be interesting to think about. I have no idea. But it's ultimately a scientific or philosophical distinction. And it's an interesting title for what is basically a novel of London social life among the upper middle classes. It shows a bit of intellectual ambition. The book, in fact, has a theory of what it meant to be agential, a term which became very trendy during the 2010s. Indeed, I found one thing speaking of an agential cut that got a bit ridiculous with that trendy theory talk in the 2010s. But we could say, for our purposes, agents are con men, fraud, cheats, and that they prey upon Bloor-Smith, who is a patient. And we could say at the beginning, at least, and this is something I'll explore further, that agents are lower on the novel's moral scale than patients. Two other items worthy of note: the X and Y, blank and blank, that is reminiscent of Ivy Compton Burnett, nearly all of whose novels are X and Y, have that and, that conjunctive and in them. And the novel contains A and P. And so that is a kind of palindromic thing. And the people like me, even the people before me, he wrote those books about AP, often wondered how to abbreviate the book, because how do you do AAP? Or do you do AP, but the author is AP. And so it's interesting that his name is reflected there. Bloor-Smith is semi-privileged, but also a victim. One of the points he clearly wants to make is that even though Bloor-Smith is not to be taken as based on Powell, unlike Nicholas Jenkins, unlike the unnamed narrator of What's Become of Waring, who I think are meant to be based on Anthony Powell. But one of the points he clearly wants to make about Bloor-Smith is that just because one has been to Oxford, one does not have it made. He's educated, he has some money, he could afford a reasonably good address. I will be interested to know from those who are more London literate than me how good an address that Ebury Street would be in the 1930s, but it's certainly not a bad address. And that makes him nothing really but a target for opportunists. Even if one has some money and is from Oxford, if you are by nature a patient, if you are not out to get people, people are going to be out to get you. Another point, of course, and this is where Ellis has some real insight of where AP is different from the 19th century novel. 19th century novels have this fundamental optimism that if you're a good person, the world will one day recognize that. And all you have to do is just show some pluck. And novelists as different as Dickens and Trollope have that. Bloor Smith is very like the hobbledehoy in Trollope. But Trollope has this idea, the hobbledehoy, the kind of confused young man, will win out one day, but not in the 20th century. It's a different world. And Ellis's interpretation of Powell very much recognizes this. Interestingly, this is one of the few books where Powell gives the point of view of a woman. And here you have Sarah Maltravers' point of view. Pedestrians or tradesmen's vans did not get quickly enough out of the way. When she reached the garage, she spent some time conferring with the garage, as you would say, hands, after they had sufficiently discussed her own car and also the new Chrysler, buying an American car that she had been brought in for repairs that afternoon. She walked across the square to that flat, planning out the article on continental car models, which she was going to write that evening. And she is a journalist covering cars, which is a very modern thing for a woman to do. In the flat, she took off her airman's helmet, her goggles, her gauntlets, her leather overcoat, and her leather jumper, without which essential minimum she never attempted to drive a car. After giving the cat some milk, she settled down at one of the typewriters. It was about half an hour later that the telephone bell rang. Sarah took up the receiver. Hello, she said, and it's Bloor Smith. And it's interesting that he goes into a woman's point of view here, which AP very rarely does. He very rarely goes out of the POV of a white privileged male such as himself. Here he does. Now, he never really did this again, and he says in the journals that he doesn't think it's really wise to do, but I think it's interesting that he experimented with this. And I think he felt he knew Evelyn Nightingale, even Gardner Nightingale, he knew her well enough, but they hadn't been lovers. But he knew her well when she was a contemporary. And that's the relationship that I think one can leap into. If she had been, an ex of his, I don't think he would have that. If she had been an older woman, I don't think he would have felt that he could do that. But I think he felt he knew her well enough to dip into her point of view. This is one of the books which contains foreign scenes in Paris and Berlin. Indeed, when we consider the Toulon scene and What's Become of Waring, 3 of AP's pre-war books contain foreign scenes. And again, it's a very essential point about AP. I don't know how he would have voted in the 2016 referendum, but he's not anti-European, and Europe is a part of his imaginative canvas. His portrait of Paris in the 1930s is parodic, farcical, but informed by a very deep understanding and empathy about French history and literature. And you only need to read Miscellaneous Verdicts Are Under Review, or Poets, Painters, and Reference Vermeillers to see how much he knows about France. Café Zuzu is an enjoyable depiction of a bohemian space. The South Americans, who the Marquis de Tour d'Espagne meets, I wonder if they're the same ones that Jenkins meets in the Ritz as he waits for Mark members in the 3rd book. Paris and Agents and Patience is not so much a bad dream, but the memory of a refining experience. And Bloor Smith, as deluded and as much of a jerk, as much of a doofus as he is, he does kind of grow in the book. And Paris is one of the things which helps refine him. This is, in my view, the funniest passage in the book. I love literary in jokes. Yo-Yo told him about her brother-in-law. Her brother-in-law wrote novels. The novels were in the style of Pierre Loti. He found it difficult, for some reason, to place them with a publisher. It seemed that he had written 3 novels in this style, and none of them had been placed. Yet her brother-in-law was not discouraged. he believed in himself. And for that to be funny, you have to know Pierre Loti, author of the Le Pêcheur d'Ilan, the Iceland fisherman, was extremely in at one point, was not at all in by the time of the 1930s when a whole new generation had replaced him. And you know that these novels are never going to be, these novels were put in the transom and never even read. But of course, they had never been placed. And that is very, very funny if you know the literary world in it. Funny in the same way Monsieur Dubuisson in Question of Upbringing, when he talks about the growth of the social idea in the English novel. Funny in the same way that is tremendously funny. Berlin gets much darker than Paris. Although AP could not have been further from the characteristic literary tone of the British 1930s, when you think of the 1930s in England, you think of Auden and Spender and Isherwood, the so-called Comintern, the homosexual version of the Comintern. It is interesting that he is a writer of the 1930s. That's when he emerged. Rosemary Colt, the daughter of Arthur Meisner, did some interesting work on that and made a very good point about that. And I think of all of those books, Ages and Patience most reflects the turbulence, uneasiness, and fear of the decade when you had, even before Hitler's ascension to power, even before Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, you had economic devastation. That the Nazi admiring Hegate was the model for Maltravers adds even more of a sense of the ominous. And certainly, even though the book doesn't say in big block letters, Nazism is a danger, the reader reading the book at the time would get that. The and film studio obviously modeled on Ufa, the waiter being named Adolf, the Jewishness of Roth, as well as of Rubinstein and Israel's, the minor characters in the book, indicate where we are. We're in the world, yes, of Isherwood's Berlin stories, and yes, Isherwood went into it much more, but also, again, my favorite novel by a member of AP's generation who's not AP, is Cyril Connolly's The Rock Pool, because The Rock Pool really gets the way Bohemian modern Europe and atavistic fascist Europe was so close to each other. And Ages and Patience touches on that as well. This is a Fräulein Grunt in Berlin, a passage from the novel. At last, she turned off into a narrow road and entered a lane that crossed it at right angles. At the end of this lane, gates like those of a level crossing blocked the way. On either side of the gates were lodges, and beyond them, at some distance off, stood a number of low, square structures like aeroplane hangars. Rising out of the center of these was a larger and more pretentious building, a sort of town hall. And beyond this again, on the horizon, the outline of Greek or Roman ruins stood out against the flat, blue gray sky. A triumphal arch stretched on above the gates, on which was written in Gothic characters, Nibelheim National Kunstfilmgesellschaft. Again, quite funny. Michael L. Ross of McMaster University up in Hamilton, Ontario, home of the Hamilton Tiger Cats hockey team, who's a man well into his 80s, but still very active. I mean, if we could get him as a speaker, I think he'd be very interesting on some of this stuff. He wrote about this book in his 2006 book, Race Riots, Comedy and Ethnicity in Modern British Fiction. And in a time, of course, of heightened consciousness about race, it's interesting to think about race in these books. And usually, Anthony Powell is not saying anything about race. But it's interesting, Ross comes up with some stuff here. He states that in Powell's early novels, exotic characters, especially Jews and Black people, are positioned on the fringes of the narrative, but have a strong symbolic relevance to those at the center. And I think you could see this in Dance with the Negro at the party at Millie Andreades' party that Mr. Deacon has the contretemps with. What Ross calls a decadent London and continental demi-mode is also a multi-ethnic world. And just to say, I go through this with my students who complain, about white writers of the past, that they have demeaning representations of people of color. And of course, they're right to call them on that. But I say, to represent those characters at all as being part of the world, to say there are Black people in the world, that is something which a lot of people at that time wanted to deny. They wanted to make those people invisible. And authors who make those characters visible, even if they are playing a satiric or parodic or minor role, I think that is important there. Ross calls Blore Smith an impeccably Anglo-Saxon name. I have to point out, I'm always looking for the Norman Saxon division in English names. Maltravers is, of course, parodically Norman. I think the only thing more Norman is Plantagenet in terms of a name. And AP is a genealogist. He knows where names come from. He knows what are Celtic and what are Saxon and what are Norman. He's very aware of this, and this gives his nomenclature great depth. He doesn't do anything so simplistic of having all the characters with Welsh names be good. He doesn't do that at all, but he has an eye out on that. And the Mal and Maltravers, but also the highfalutin Normanness of the name makes it sound kind of villainous. We have the two knaves there, mentioned at the end of the book. The book ends by Commander Venables going off to Basra, and maybe, of course, that's where the British troops invaded and involved in the 2003 invasion of Iraq were based. So maybe they honor his memory. And Chipchase and Maltravers go off to America, which is a natural home of con man, as Herman Melville famously said in The Confidence Man, but also where AP, at about the same time, attempted, not really succeeding, to break into the world of Hollywood script writing. This is another way in which Chipchase, in an outward way, is like AP. In another way, the moral malfeasance of the agents is not affirmed. And this is very like the end of a Victorian novel, where the people who do bad things, they might not be killed, but they're expelled from the society. They have to go off to the colonies. They have to go to Australia. They have to go to India. And Chipchase and Maltravers going off to America is saying they may have tricked Blore Smith, but not to the extent that they reign triumphant within the society. They have to leave England. Blore Smith tells Chipchase and Maltravers that all he wants is to be left alone, and that is how they leave him. Here, Paul was very kind to mention my 2004 book. Here, I'm going to correct my book. And it may be tiresome to see me just correct my material from 19 years ago, but as Yeats famously said, rhetoric is your quarrel with the world, poetry is your quarrel with yourself. So this is kind of my quarrel with my earlier self. Back then, I thought Blore Smith had not changed at all, that his only benefit was that of experience, that he, to quote T.S. Eliot, had the experience but missed the meaning. Now I have a revised opinion, and I did. James Tucker, Bill James, our much missed late member, got this much more than I did. He focused on Colonel Teep, one of the best known faces on the Côte d'Azur, who is always urging the breaking of barriers in one of the running jokes of the novel. Teep is somebody who Blore Smith apparently either had some sort of homosexual liaison or liaison, or at least Blore Smith realizes that Teep has a gay interest in him, which he might not share, he might not reciprocate, but there is a kind of panic in him that this character, this older man, has an interest in him, which is kind of homoerotic. You see, incidentally, I feel there's a slight bit of homoeroticism in the relationship of Thompson and Sir Gavin in A Buyer's Market, for instance. I think you see a trace of something like that there. And Blore Smith certainly feels that Teep does not want him to socialize with women. And Blore Smith, who already has such, as Kingsley Amis would later put it, difficulties with girls, feels that Colonel Teep is blocking him in some way. And at the novel's end, Teep quite coercively says, come live with me in Saint-Tropez. Blore Smith seems powerless to say no, but inferentially he does not. And the reader has to tease this out, but Blore Smith doesn't. And here I think Blore Smith does have some agency. And he stops being a patient, or maybe, he realizes that to be a patient at this point would be gay. And to affirm his heterosexuality, he has to be an agent. But I would say that is a bit of learning, a bit of development. It's very much between the lines. And so I had to reread it a number of times to get that, but I do think James Tucker got that, and I didn't, that he develops a bit. What can you say? You cannot really talk about this book without talking about Dorothy Varda. When the ever understating AP calls a woman somebody not entirely to be disregarded, when he calls a woman that is high praise indeed. Jeff Manley and Jean Rollison have gone extensively into Varda in past newsletters. Hilary Sperling has, of course, gone into Varda, and Michael Barber did as well as its own biography. I think we have a lot on Varda and what she meant to a young Anthony Powell. Mrs. Mendoza is tall and fair-haired, but wears an overcoat of military cut and steps into the room like a man. Somewhat like, and I just taught Sun Also Rises, somewhat like Lady Brett Ashley, who's modeled on Duff Twisden, and I know AP thought Duff Twisden unattractive, and having seen Duff Twisden's pictures, it could be twice, because it's Twisden or Twisden, it's one or the other. I understand what he meant by that, but I would say that Mrs. Mendoza and her basis of Dorothy Varda is a model of the new woman. And Blore Smith, even though she humiliates him, which he definitely does, he learns something from her. And he learns, I think it's interesting, the women he is interested in, Sarah Maltravers and Mrs. Mendoza, are both new women. They are 20th century women. They are the kind of women that for a man to relate to women in the 20th century, he will have to know. So I do think Blore Smith is learning a bit about women, and I do think Anthony Powell is doing a decent job of representing modern women. Would a woman writer do it differently? Sure. But I do think he is doing a decent job of representing modern women, and he continued to do that in Dance with, particularly with the female characters like Eleanor Walpole Wilson, like Rosie Manash, who Nick Jenkins is not romantically involved with. I think those characters, and Stepney and Umfreville is another one, those characters are very, very good characters in terms of modern women being written by a male author. They exert some sort of erotic appeal for Blore Smith and presumably the implied author. And I think it's very important that the representation of women get away from that Susan Nunnery style figure towards this more modern woman. And again, you see in Dance the way clearly, and the narrator is much more interested in Barbara Goring. He respects Eleanor Walpole Wilson more, and he respects Rosie Manash more than Barbara Goring. And Barbara Goring is kind of Susan Nunnery, who is Enid Firminger, as Jeff Manley pointed out. There is a lot of androgyny and queerness in the novel, and it's interesting, again, that's something we're talking about a lot these days. We have Major Fosdick, the transvestite figure in From a View to a Death. It's interesting that these two books have this, and obviously, this is a different era. Today, we're talking about these issues very openly. In the 1930s, people did not. And the novels From a View to a Death and agents and patients are representing what we would today call queer, androgynous, transgender themes. They are representing these. I'm not trying to make AP politically correct or trendy in pointing that out. I'm just pointing out that that representation is there on the surface and as part of the mesh of these books. And if you don't understand that, you are probably going to see the books as slighter than they in fact are. This, to me, we are getting to the key question about the pre-war novels. And in Dance, even though the characters aren't black and white, and the appeal of, I think, why a lot of people like AP is there's clearly moral clarity in his works, but it's not cartoonish. So it's not like Star Wars where you have Darth Vader. Lord Wimberpool and Lord Vader are different figures, even though they're both lords. So I think there is subtlety in AP, but also in Dance, but also moral clarity. In the early novels, there doesn't seem to be that moral clarity in the same way. We see bad things, deception, fraud, delusion, but they're really no good things. And the only people who do things are doing bad things. And when people today talk about being agential, and you often see this, people talk about female agency, which means women who get to make their own choices. If you hang around academia, you hear this these days. To be an agent is to do. And to talk about people as agents is in a way trying to talk about people without always putting intentionality in, without always putting that first person subjectivity in. So to say I have agency is something very different than saying I'm doing this because of who I innately am. It's more of a focus on the deeds. And it is away from the individual intentionality. But you still want a positive version of agency. And I do think, and Ellis does not believe that AP has a positive version of agency. I think Ellis would have been very surprised by the Powell of A Dance to the Music of Time, who out of his disassemblage of the vestiges of the 19th century novel, rebuilds a macro edifice, which isn't a 19th century novel, but it has the density and in the end, the social and moral optimism that the 19th century novel does. But I agree with Ellis, AP had to disassemble it and to take the elements apart. There is a sense, because Agents and Patients is about fraud and deception, there is a sense it is almost a crime novel. And one of the things to note in general about AP's early works, the first 5 novels, they are short and they are about the same length as detective fiction was in that era, as a Marjorie Allingham or Agatha Christie novel would have been. 198 pages. It's about the same length. And there's kind of a problem and a solution in AP's early books, even though there's no mystery. And the one that's talked about in terms of mystery was What's Become of Waring. AP doesn't really write mysteries, but here at least he writes a crime novel. And it's a crime novel in terms of being about criminals, but also about in terms of being short and brief and not representing an entire society. And that is part of the breakdown. The birth of the crime novel is part of the breakdown of the 19th century novelistic synthesis. And AP's early work is in the wake of that breakdown. He can't write like Dickens, he can't write like Trollope. He doesn't have that social optimism or that optimism about people that Dickens or Trollope did. But this does not mean that Powell does not believe in a positive version of agency. putting my cards on the table. I fundamentally believe this. I made this clear at York in my keynote speech of 2016. I do believe that Anthony Powell, in Nicholas Jenkins, is fashioning a positive version of agency, is somebody who is a doer and who does things and is not evil and is not a con man. If the protagonists of the pre-war novels, including Blore Smith, are Jenkins Monkey, and one of the previous American critics to me came up with that term. I didn't come up with that. Maybe it was John Russell who came up with that term. What they manqué, what they lack, is good agency. And even the narrator of Waring doesn't have that kind of agency. I'm about to wrap up. When you're looking at dance, you obviously see it has expanded horizons and it has a much broader canvas. But Agents is on the way there. It's getting towards that good agency. And I think one of the reasons it's getting there is AP himself is growing. And I feel that in myself. I have more good agency now in 2023 than I did in 2004. I just have more power. I just have more standing in the literary world. I have grown up a lot. I've gotten married. Things have happened in my life. I just can feel that. And AP, I think, felt that as well. He had married, of course, to Lady Violet. He was beginning, his works had received positive notices. He was beginning to see a bit more he feel in a better position, which made him able to see a bit more into things. And I would say, even though I want to give nothing but praise to G.U. Ellis, but I really think that Powell's beginning to go beyond Ellis's version of him, even in the 1930s. And Powell was developing into a self-confident writer, but also a writer with more of a sense of self. And that sense of self is, even though Blore Smith is no more than a victim, that sense of self is behind him and kind of bolstering him. In a purely literary sense, Powell had explored the mode of what the Germans call the Neue Sachlichkeit, pardon my German, the new objectivity, as much as he could. And I do think looking at early AP through the mode of the Neue Sachlichkeit is more interesting than looking at him through the mode of Wyndham Lewis. But even there, you can't be objective forever. You have to bring back that subjectivity. We need it. I just think we need it as human beings. You need coherent solidity, optimism. He had to, after a point, affirm his own truth. And even if there is no particularly positive vision in Agents, there is a sense of the unattractiveness of the agents, which shows a novelist beginning to develop a moral compass. And I would say, without saying every writer has to be moralistic or wear their heart on their sleeve, that you need a moral compass to have that vision of the human condition that the great novelists had. And that AP was beginning to feel, I have what it takes to compete to write work like the writers we know he admired, like Balzac or Dostoevsky, or the writers of the past that he did. And obviously the fulfillment of that is dance. This is not to relegate the pre-war novels to minor works. I think it's very important to read them, and very important to read them without reference to dance. But you do have to admit that Powell had at some point to write differently. He needed to take stock of the extraneous things and the things he had thrown out in the earlier work. By the mid-1930s, and I wasn't there, obviously, but I think most people understood there would be another war. And I think you only have to go back and look at magazines from 1935 to 1936, even here, even to read, say, Time magazine in the US from those years, you will see that. And in the kindly ones, it is said the country had lived some time under threat of war. It's interesting that Waring, though, is a sunnier book than Agents and Patients. It's a happier, it's a sunnier book, even though it's published in 1939. My hypothesis is Powell, and I go into, I think AP and I would have a different, AP and I would argue about Munich, but I'm not going to go into that. I do think Powell thought that at Munich, Chamberlain bought time, and that he bought enough time so that Britain could win the war. I personally would have fought for the Czechs in 1938, but I understand Powell's reasoning. Gerhard Weinberg, the Jewish German historian, actually agrees with what I think AP is saying. And I think that Powell by 1939 still knows there will be a war, but thinks that Britain will win. Thus, I would say there is a link between good agency and Powell. In a sense, Britain would both fight and win the Second World War. And this became even more augmented after the war had transpired. So when Nick Jenkins speaks, when Nick Jenkins talks about that, I remember back then, I didn't know yet, he's always doing it from the vantage point of after the war. It could be 1936, it could be 1951, it could be 1971, but it's never in 1938 when you see that Nick Jenkins looking back. This is Ellis on the oncoming of war. Since the completion of this book, international events have given a new implication to certain passages contained therein. It has seemed preferable to leave such passages uncorrected, since the general tenor of the ideas expressed is an admission that events at large could thus easily confute the critical niceties that in every age accompany its literary assessment, and how quickly the war could change attitudes, and how quickly the oncoming of war could change attitudes and change literary attitudes, and how you thought the war would turn out would affect that. And Ellis very much gets that. The visions of good agency that AP developed in this novel led to an awareness of extraneous things and allowed for the understanding of love affairs that were not sordid. Ages and Patience is where the wheel begins to turn and the pole of the mature years emerge, all the while remaining a compelling and menacing portrait of an uncertain, desperate time and the people during that time who so cruelly took advantage of others. Many thanks for your listening, and we have a few minutes left for questions, I think. Thank you very much, and let's have some questions.
Thank you very much, Nick. Very interesting, really very interesting. Okay, raise your hands if you want to join the discussion. Start off with Paul.
Thank you, Nick. A lot to unpack there. Thanks
Yeah.
for highlighting the Ellis book, which I didn't know. I'll go to. I just want to make one observation. You mentioned about this is where AP introduces a woman's point of view, unusually in Sarah Maltravers, and I think physically she certainly resembles Evelyn Gardner, so in the way she is described, but actually in terms of the very good dialogue, I mean the very realistic dialogue between her and Maltravers and others, I think it reflects the fact that AP is living with Violet. The book is dedicated to Violet Georgiana, and many of the domestic sort of details, such as the cat being given milk and the tip-tapping of Sarah's typewriter in the next room, because Violet was writing articles at that point, wasn't she? Sure. And I think he gained confidence from that sort of marriage, and he learned in that domestic setting much more about the interplay between a man and a woman in that sort of situation than he did before. So he was able to raise his dialogue actually to a different level and represent the woman's point of view much more fully. So
I could not agree more.
Big influence on him. Yeah.
I could not, and that's very important that he did dedicate the book to Lady Violet, and this is definitely a book written after his marriage. And even though because we know he read parts of From a View to a Death aloud to Lady Violet when he was courting her at Tully, and this is the first book he writes totally after the marriage. And it doesn't announce that with bells and whistles, but you can very subtly see that. Same way you can see it in Far from the Madding Crowd with Thomas Hardy, which I think is the first book he writes after he marries Emma. You could just see that a bit more. And I do think, I also thought of Lady Pansy Lamb, Violet's elder sister. The way Paul describes her in memoirs reminds me a bit. But I do agree, the daily way Sarah Maltravers thinks, yeah, the woman he would know best is Lady Violet. And he might have thought, yes, now I know a woman well enough to be able to write about a woman, definitely. And that's very important. I mean, that very much bolsters a lot of the points that I'm trying to make about this book. And of that, the way the positive developments in his own life led to an augmented sense of self that gives this book a bit more of a dimension. So thank you very much for that.
Michael Henley had your hand up. Michael, can you hear me? You're on mute.
I hear you. Am I off mute now?
Yeah.
You're certainly off mute. We could hear you loud and clear.
Well, I want to thank you, Nick, for the talk. And I wanted to urge you to post the slides somewhere because they went by a little too fast for me. I want to ponder some of those perceptions.
Okay, I'll send them around, and I know it was a rather dense. I actually looked at. I saw I had 27 slides. I thought, my goodness, how am I going to get through this in an hour? So I will send that along. I probably got a bit too beguiled by the character models, which are so fascinating. They were perhaps extraneous, but I will certainly send that around, and the society can post it on the website, and I would do that. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Gene?
Let me jump in. You asked about Ebury Street.
Yeah.
Nick.
Yeah.
Definitely a good address.
Yeah.
It's about 2 streets to the east of Eaton Square, when Belgrave Square rather is about 2 streets to the west, to give you an idea. So it's in the land of the first 2 of the night of the 3 parties.
Yeah, and I have been on Ebury Street. That is very much now where part of London American tourists would go. I just didn't know what it was in the 1930s, and what I found in the internet was rather imprecise, but I'm glad to be reassured of that. Yeah. And he has the money to be able to afford a place on Ebury Street. And the point of the book is saying, just because you have the money and have an Oxford degree does not mean your life is going to be wonderful and people aren't going to trick you and you aren't going to be unhappy, unfulfilled, uncertain in life, all of these things that this character is. So I think that's a very interesting juxtaposition there.
Yep. I mean, not quite as prestigious as Eaton Square or Belgrave Square, obviously, but certainly up there.
Yeah.
Interesting. Jean Reed had her hand up and she's disappeared somewhere.
Jean was
she's been having problems, I think, with her connectivity.
I had to admit her 4 or 5 times during.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Is she around?
Okay.
I don't see her around anymore. Well, maybe she'll come back.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything else to raise? No, silence. Nobody want to?
I think
their hand up.
I think we're in awe.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that this is a book. To me, this is a book if I had to urge one of the pre-war books upon people, this would be it. Not Venusberg is funnier. From a View to a Death is funnier. Certainly What's Become of Waring gives the role of dance, gives the essential role of dance much more. I read Waring in between reading Question of Upbringing and A Buyer's Market in 1978. I read Question of Upbringing, then I read Waring, which my mother had around, and then Buyer's Market. And that was really helpful for me in getting situated. And certainly Afternoon Men is the donné of it all. It's the genesis of it all. But Age of Impatience to me is the one pre-war book which has everything in it. Michael?
Michael? You're on mute.
I came to the talk aware that this was the book that I least enjoyed of Powell's pre-war novels. I bet there's some people that share my view of that. And I came convinced that, Nick, you would try and convince me that it really, really deserved reading. And I believe you succeeded with that.
Mm-hmm. You know, thank you very much for that. And I mean, it's a depressing book. And it is, I understand why people wouldn't like it, because it probably is, at least on the surface, his most downbeat book. And when I actually wrote that in 2002, but it was published in 2004. I think I kind of fell for that. I fell for the downbeatness, and I fell into a readerly trap that the novel has for an unsuspecting reader. And if you read it a bit more deeply and read between the lines, I think this is the book you have to read between the lines, just like you have to read early Hemingway between the lines, or like you have to read Joseph Conrad, later Conrad, between the lines. And the more you read between the lines, I think the less depressing and the more of a dimension of hope it is. But I certainly understand when you read it for the first time, it seems a depressing book about the hapless Blore Smith and the conniving Maltravers and Chip Chase. And it just seems a depressing tableau, because Blore Smith is nothing else but hapless.
Mm-hmm. Okay, how are we doing? Anybody else? We've just gone 6 o'clock. So, Michael, you've still got your hand up. Are you wanting more? No. Okay.
I do that so much with Zoom classes. I think John Rowe has his hand raised.
John, yes.
You're on mute, John.
Yeah,
Hello,
thank you, Nick. As we knew it would be, that was an absolute tour de force. It's a long time since I've read Agents and Patients, so I'm not on firm ground here, but I'd just like to take us back away from the 30s, even though you've grounded it so well there, back to the Jacobean world. Because I've always thought of this as being a bit like one of those Ben Jonson comedies where you have a gullible type, Blore Smith, who is preyed upon by characters who are conniving rogues, as in, say, The Alchemist, you know, that sort of world, or even in some of the other Jacobean, like Women Beware Women, where you have a gullible person. And so, but that would take it away from some of the things you've been affirming, really. But it would certainly leave you in a rather depressed area, because I have to say that when I do read those wonderful comedies, they're wonderful, but only to a degree, and they don't have the kind of Shakespearean sense of humanity. They deny it. And although I'm taking you away from the 30s, I think some of the things you've been affirming could be sort of perhaps thought of along that model, if you like, that parallel.
Totally, John, I totally understand, because I often have students come to me and say, I've read Shakespeare, because I sometimes teach Shakespeare. I've read Shakespeare, and then I've gone to Marlowe or Johnson or Webster or Tourneur or Middleton, any of the other great Elizabethan Jacobean dramatists, and I don't have that same feeling, and I don't have that same sense of depth. And I understand that, and particularly between Shakespeare and Johnson, and that Johnsonian comedy is more stock and has that cruelty to it. So I totally understand that. And I do think the innocence of Bloor Smith is the innocence of, the comic ingenue, but also I thought of the Antipholuses in Comedy of Errors, that kind of character as well. There's a kind of where he just is young and doesn't know anything, and that means that he could discover things or that other people can trick him. Bloor Smith is not worldly, and he has that same sense of unworldliness. That the protagonist of that sort of comedy has. And you could go even further. You could go back to New Comedy and Menander, and you could go way back and talk about that. And I do think the genesis of this is ultimately dramatic. And remember, the book in the frame of a film, and the fact that it's presenting people making a film. And cinema is, of course, a dramatic form and built upon the drama, is in a way acknowledging that. And we all know, of course, AP was deeply immersed in both Shakespeare and the Jacobean dramatists, who he had a very deep, very like T.S. Eliot did, although I think AP had a very different motivation than T.S. Eliot did in being interested in that material. But AP had a very deep interest in that material, and was already, I think, one of the things we get from the genealogical research that gives us the name Venables, to the point that John just made, is by the time AP writes Ages and Patience, he is in his early 30s. Not only is he embarked on his lifelong marriage with Lady Violet, he's embarked on being the kind of reader that will make him a great writer. And reading the 17th century, reading in the 17th century, that the depth that he does, that produces the Aubrey book, but also produces so much else in his work, and so many quotations and resonances from Shakespeare and from, Marlowe isn't that important for him, so maybe more the Jacobean than Elizabethan dramatists. That's very important. And I think having that would be very good background to understand that book. Reading some of Volpone, reading some of these Johnsonian comedies would be very good background for that. And, that would be interesting. And yes, the book, that's what makes him an interesting writer, is he is in the 30s, but not entirely of the 30s, because his writing transcends that and is being informed by the very wide and sensitive reading that he's doing. And AP's discovery of himself as a reader in Messengers of Day, the second volume of To Keep the Ball Rolling, his autobiography, there's that chapter called Set Books, where he is kind of saying, it was in this period, the period I married Lady Violet, that I began to discover myself as a reader. And without AP as reader, you do not have AP as writer in the way that we do.
Okay, thank you, Nick. It's interesting.
Yeah,
Paul
thanks,
looks as if
Nick.
he's about to.
Keith, can I suggest we sort of wrap it up now? We're now
Yes, I was.
6:15.
I was just going to say, Paul, do you want to? Make some closing comments? Yeah,
can I just thank Nick again for a fascinating talk, and as usual after these talks, I will now immediately reread the book as I've learned so much more about it. Thanks to everybody for joining. We have 2 more standalone novel talks coming up after the summer break. But anyway, more of these to come. And thanks again to Nick, and thanks for everybody, and have a good summer.
Thank you very much.